Welcome to the Broken Lens podcast. This is Adam Stutz.
And I'm Heather Watson.
Hi, how's it going?
Hi, good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm enjoying this cool weather that we're continuing to experience. I'm very happy about that.
Yes, same. So I've been meaning to ask you. I know you had an interview recently. I would love to hear more about it.
I did. My friend Adam Greenfield has a podcast about the writing scene in San Diego, and it was a really cool experience. It's interesting being on the other side of the microphone.
Was that your first podcast as a guest?
No, actually, I've been on another friend's podcast years ago, and it was also like kind of similar bent in that I read work and kind of like talked about being a writer, but it was another friend of mine, my friend Sean Roney, and he had a podcast going for a little while, and it was kind of in and around the time that like my first book came out, and so like we were just kind of chatting it up. But this discussion that Adam Greenfield and I had was very much focused on like craft and discussing like the writing scene in San Diego, and also kind of getting my bearings in the writing scene in Los Angeles and kind of comparing the two scenes, and it was cool. It was a cool conversation. I definitely was a little nervous like when I first got on the microphone, and it was a little strange.
I mean, you're not controlling the show the same way that you would be as a host, right?
Yeah, and I mean, he wasn't asking any damning questions or anything.
Yeah, sure.
It was just a great conversation. I think, as is not atypical for me, like I'm, a little nervous, and so sometimes I can run my mouth a little bit, and that was definitely the case like when we were chatting. And so I'm curious whenever, the final product rolls out to hear whether my train of logic kind of like gets completely derailed at the beginning of the conversation, and we're kind of all over the place. It was interesting to kind of compare also like just how he does like the production. He's been doing this for many years, and he has a much more sophisticated setup and can kind of control his levels more like during the course of the conversation. And
Sure.
the microphones that you have are much higher quality. So it was a cool experience, and I hope I have the opportunity to jump on other podcasts at some point to discuss writing or anything kind of pop culture related. Would be kind of cool too. I'd love to get on a podcast about like movies and things, because I could definitely nerd out about that.
Very cool. I'm excited to listen.
Our guests this week were Alex Braslavsky and Jos Charles. And Jos we had published in the very first issue of Broken Lens Journal, and Alex we published in issue 4. I love my conversation with Jos. Jos is an incredible poet. She's a wonderful scholar, and I think she has such a interesting set of work, and like just kind of the trajectory of her work through the 3 books that have been published in recent years. Most recently, A Year, and prior to that, Field, which was a nominee for the Pulitzer Prize. Like I said, wonderful poet. She has an incredible faculty with language, and I am so blown away by the books that she's written. And I just really like listening to her talk at length about her writing experience, her work as an educator. I just think she's a brilliant person. And then by contrast, Alex Braslavsky, who is also a brilliant scholar, she's in her 4th year of her PhD program at Harvard. And she is one of these poets who has yet to have a book come out, but I'm very eager for her to publish something at some point in the near future, because I think she is very deserving of having that platform. I think she is extremely talented. I love her use of surrealism in her work. She has a very interesting way of like taking kind of like, environmental subject matter and environmentalism, and then like kind of weaving it in and applying it to these personal experiences. It's very deft. It doesn't feel very heavy-handed at all. And she also just has a very interesting background by way of speaking multiple languages and working in translation. And I think she's great. With that, let's turn to my interviews with Jos Charles and Alex Braslavsky. Jos Charles, welcome to the Broken Lens podcast. We're so grateful to have you here.
Thanks, Adam. It's great to be here.
I was wondering if we could start out by having you read the first sonnet from issue 1 of the journal.
Yeah, so this is a sonnet. The blinking lights looked like sirens of cop cars, yet were Christmas lights. Vision was a dream, and yet the row of shops look like reliquaries tonight. Community is metaphysical, yet in a circle you place a US dollar into my hand. The cyclist was a bastard, yet let dangle a jacket of animal skin. Revision is a reel rolled past a film we arrived too late to see, yet the square footage it takes to build a gallery sign says camping not allowed here. It takes a tongue of fire to lick a fire. Swallows in the mold, yet.
I love that line. It takes a tongue of fire to lick a fire, and the enjambment of the line of fire, and then swallows in the mold yet. I mean, it's wonderful. Your writing, among many other wonderful qualities, has this incredible capacity for inverting the syntax of the lyric. And I feel you're incredibly generous with creating this opportunity, this invitation for your reader to be enveloped in a very almost subversive diction. I'm thinking, of course, of your second book, Field, where the reader is given this opportunity to really explore the physicality of sound in the language, words that are almost spelled out phonetically, but also harken back to Middle English in a way. But I'm also thinking of the syntactical arrangements that you have in A Year and Other Poems that feel incredibly intricate assemblages of disparate notes that almost creates this whole new tapestry. And I was just wondering maybe if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with the lyric. And do you feel like the lyric, for example, offers more to you as a writer than, say, the narrative?
Yeah, these are all good questions. I think, and thank you for the very kind words. I try to be generous, but there's also a degree to which, right? Like one tries to be very clear about unclear things. So there's always this fear of unclarity, or like obfuscation or something. I think it's a few things, maybe. I think part of it is the narrative has been naturalized as sort of given in a way that what you're calling the lyrical, what I might just call the poetic, generally isn't quite as naturalized as a default way of associating or producing meaning, which narrative may be in the sense that we're thinking of it, which I think is like a sort of like Western novel cause and effect based sort of resolution based thinking, which feels, if not really Western, like at least kind of Christian or something, this like logic of fulfillment, like things happen and they culminate and they resolve. And this is based around some sort of maybe like dialectical thinking. I don't know, like struggle, resolution, synthesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, stability, instability, stability, whatever sort of terms get plugged in. Narrative kind of likes to truck along in this way. But that requires a great deal of work for that to seem natural, right? Because like there's no reason that it ought to seem natural. It's not even cause and effect, I guess. It's like a particular form of causality on top of it. And I think like with poetry, at least the way I think of it, it's more co-occurrent. Like things appear in the same space, and their appearance in the same space produces a meaning that doesn't necessarily ever fold into this, therefore this. It doesn't ever reduce to like the copula or like to the definitional always. So sometimes things just kind of accrue in these weird ways. And I'm trying to think of like an example. Yeah, can't think of something off the top of my head, but like within the poem, maybe. I'm thinking of like I was working on this poem, and at some point I was revising it, and I was sitting at a coffee shop, and someone riding a motorcycle that was very loud drove by, and they were holding their jacket off to the side, right? And so I was like, oh, well, I should just put that in the poem, right? Like,
Yeah.
the cyclist was a bastard, yet let dangle a jacket of animal skin, right? Like, it just happened, and it kind of fit the form of the thing I was editing. And it felt like, why not let it in? You know, it felt like somehow it resonated with the other materials that were there for me. That's kind of, I guess, poetic thinking. Like, there's nothing narratively that beckoned for it to be in the poem. It wasn't involved in the relation of things that were being built. And even this is kind of a scene somewhat, like we get scenic elements like these lights and, reliquaries on kind of a street, which makes one think of like a downtown maybe. And this is all true. I was in downtown Long Beach for all of this, but like that's just a situation for the disparate materials to accrue.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm kind of talking around your question maybe a little bit, but I think like that's what I like about poems is they can let these sorts of things accrue. But then there's this other element of the syntax, which is partially, I think, just how I speak. Like I think I do that in my speech, like this winding, syntactical, caveated speech that like sort of lands elsewhere other than it began, like that sentence, you know? And that could be tied to a lot of things, you know, I don't know, maybe it's just how I talk, maybe it has to do with like neurodivergence or something, I don't know. But that element, I like letting that element have a certain degree of permission to explore its resolution within my writing that I may not allow, for instance, like in this conversation, you know, because like I want to communicate with you, right? And I want to like meet in the middle in a kind of way that a poem is already sort of declaring its own middle, you know, so it like gives me the space to sit with it.
Yeah. I tend to think in, I guess, a very nonlinear way, and I have a lot of associative leaps in my own writing, and certainly I think there's a logic that makes sense to me, but someone who may not be familiar with that type of kind of disjointed way of thinking might find those associative leaps or the kind of the strange intricacies of like how that language unfolds as being, I don't want to say like off-putting, but like at least insofar as it can feel challenging sometimes. And so I think, I know on a personal level for me, when I read your work, there is a commonality, there almost like a common language in terms of the structure that makes sense to me. And I think that it is, wonderful invitation again for, I think, readers of all stripes to be able to see how plastic language is and how those leaps and associations can start to, manifest in this way that, will bend the structure of language and create these new relationships that may not have been like readily apparent, and something that is, these momentary flashes, as you described with this image of the motorcycle and the animal skin hanging off. I too feel like I do, like I try to grab that things around me and then try to, kind of weave them in. And then I typically find like when I'm editing my work, then what happens is that's when all of a sudden something unfolds in terms of structure. And there is something that may not have seemed apparent at the start, but then all of a sudden something kind of comes into shape, and it's an odd shape, but it's a shape that makes sense to me. In your approach to syntax, there's something very familiar, and I appreciate that as a reader and kind of how I relate to the world and everything and relate to language.
Thanks. Yeah.
I noted at the start of the interview that, so the two poems that we published are sonnets, and you have mentioned that you're working on a larger project that uses the sonnet. And I love that your sonnets are indicative and distinctive to you, to your voice. I think when I read these sonnets, these are Jos Charles sonnets. And that's kind of like the same thing I experience if I read sonnets by Terrence Hayes or Wanda Coleman or Ted Berrigan, that you're taking a form that I think some, listeners might think, it brings them back to maybe their high school English classes, or maybe like a survey course for lit that they had to take during college, where, immediately they probably think of like Shakespearean sonnets or Petrarchan
Hmm.
sonnets, and yet the sonnet has so much more variation to it, and it's such an interesting form, and one that I think is also ripe for deconstruction.
Hmm.
And I was just wondering, what is it about the sonnet that attracts you to the form, and
Hmm.
how do you feel like you're working towards making the sonnet distinctive for you and reflective of your voice and your experience?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's like maybe the flip side of the answer I just gave about the poetic versus like the narrative. Like it's precisely because like narrative is maybe overdetermined or overrepresented that like it can also be done well, right? It's like precisely because it can have like a hegemonic function that it can also then be a tool of, let's just say, resistance or like denaturalization or
Mm-hmm.
something. And narrative and causality could be really important, right? Like sometimes people might obscure something that causality is an important part of. I'm thinking even in that first poem, Camping Not Allowed Here, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
a poetic gesture that the state often does, right? To displace people who are unhoused. And like it's a poetic leap. It's not camping, right? Like it's a substitution that's happening. But if we were to think maybe more narratively and cause and effect based thinking about it, it's like, no, you're displacing people, right? And anyways, I give this caveat because to me that's kind of precisely what's appealing about this sonnet is like that it has all this weight um and it has all this like it's been settled, yeah, in a kind of way. And so the position that it often occupies, which is like being taught to write them, being taught 14 lines and being taught this many syllables, that sort of disciplinary position doesn't have to correspond to the sonnet, right? It's just like happened to have corresponded to the
Yeah.
sonnet because of, well, like a sort of Western literary imperialism and sense of superiority and so on. But like it's a really silly form and it's really um gay in like a straight sense or something, like it's really like just like addressed to a you and you like pour everything out to this you and you exhaust it. And yeah, if we're thinking of the turn to this idea that like you then turn away like either towards the reader or toward the beloved or in some kind of like shift of address, that's a really potentially cool gesture, right? And could be utilized for lots of things. But because we get stuck on this, like the way that got taught, at least to me, and maybe to you, like in this high school sense, is like syllables and lines. But when I go and read sonnets that I like, the commonalities that emerge to me are not this. The commonalities are like, yeah, the address, the intimacy, they're kind of epistolary. They kind of have this like intimacy and like confusion around speaker, addressed, and reader. And I like all of these elements of sonnet. So it's like I wanted to kind of sit with those, kind of much like I'm thinking like also we could think of like haiku, because I think these
Mm-hmm.
are equally taught to me in a disciplinary way. But of course it's an appropriation, right? Because it's like getting taught by sort of again white literary supremacy or something, just like appropriating a form apart from it, but then teaching it as if it only had to do with syllable count and not that it had to do with, again, placement of speaker, season, time, the overlap and cycle of various forms of time, spiritual and secular and so on, that was just like kept out of the teaching and it got reduced to syllable count is equally like an appropriative disciplinary gesture. And of course, like whatever, the sonnet will be fine in a way that maybe like this appropriation is much more fucked because of power lines, but it's somewhat a same misattribution, I think, that's happening to the sonnet. Like it's being conflated as certain rules that really is like a reverse engineered way of approaching the thing
Mm-hmm.
rather than thinking of it first and foremost as like an envelope or a material that can hold certain things.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because for me, like anytime you invoke a form, you are operating maybe with like constraints, and
Mhm.
so but I like the idea of being able to bend, disrupt, maybe break the constraints, and being able to, again, like create new dimensions, new structure almost, and
Mhm.
by showing someone that you don't need to have a certain number of metrical feet in the
Mhm.
line. This doesn't have to have an A B C D C D C D like rhyme
Mhm.
scheme, and
Yeah.
you don't need to have a tight couplet necessarily at the end. But it is interesting. Do you feel that there are any other forms that you find yourself attracted to, where maybe the form seems particularly ripe for reinvention or for breaking? I spoke about this with another one of our contributors, Jason Montgomery, that I love the Pantoum, for example.
Mhm.
I use that as an opportunity to kind of get out of the echo chamber of my head sometimes, and
Mhm.
just because it's focused so much on certain sonic qualities. But are there forms for you that you feel you're sitting there going like, this looks like this would be interesting to maybe kind of tear apart and reassemble and
Mhm.
completely subvert? um is there anything that like comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think there's two impulses towards this gesture. There's one which is like satiric, which I don't think I could actually pursue, which is like it's like sometimes you encounter something and think like, I wonder how I could make that work.
Hmm.
And that's sort of the satiric. It's almost like doing an impression or something of Trump or something, like it's like trying to make fun of the thing rather than do right by it. And I've thought that about like I I have like lots of projects that I know I'll never do, but one it's like it would be really fun to do like a dramatic monologue of a like
Oh.
historical figure,
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
and because that's like such like a project, like I don't know, like a kind of not just Browning, but like this kind of like 19th century like the great man myth, and like that seems really kind of funny to try to do. But like I think it's like at the level of this like satire, like I couldn't see a way in that wouldn't be disparaging towards the form, and that doesn't appeal to me as much. I think the ballad is really appealing to me
Mm.
right now, and also the persona poem. So like if the kind of bad faith way of poetry we got taught was kind of like, here are the forms and here's the rules you have to follow. I feel like maybe the bad faith form people get taught more so now is like the myth of expression. Like, oh, you're writing about yourself and you get to write about whatever's going on in your life. And this like sense that the I and the speaker and the poet like all overlap and are the same thing, which
Hmm.
is like we were taught, I think, pretty actively to not think that way.
Hmm.
Or like I remember it was that sort of like new criticism, like, "Oh, no, that's the speaker, that's not and like a very gentle sense of wanting to not name the speaker as the poet.
Hmm.
And I think for good reason that's been avoided because it's got lots of problems. But I think, respectively, on the other side of things, that also potentially has problems. To think that language is natural in this kind of way, and that like everyone approaches the I with the same history and weight and ease of access, which isn't true. So I think the ballad where you're like describing sort of some character and you're personifying them in some kind of characterizing way seems far from
Hmm.
contemporary poetry in a way that is exciting to me, unless it were to enter like legibility as like, I don't know, like if I were to write like a series of poems about, I don't know, like Chelsea Manning or something, like it would,
Uh,
yeah, there'd be like this kind of like trans recuperative gesture. But if I were to write a bunch of ballads about like made up people, that would feel really far from a kind of contemporary poetry book. And
yeah.
that's kind of exciting to me. And likewise with persona poems, like just poems that inhabit another person's point of view, because it would like, I don't know, push against that gesture. And those seem exciting to me.
Yeah. Also brings to mind the ode, and
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some pretty well executed humorous odes. I've also seen some
Mm-hmm.
odes that have been wonderfully devastating, and I find it interesting. There does seem to be, you have a reverence for the religious, and I'm not saying like religion, but
Mhm.
for the religious, there is a certain reverence for the divine. You very deftly and like weave it in a very subtle way, because oftentimes you'll come away from your poems and feel like there is this opportunity, this openness to be able to like experience the transformational power that is associated with the divine. And I wonder if you could maybe like talk about how that, because being someone who is not religious, I bristle a little bit when I think about organized religion, but the religious and some like religious iconography, for example, I do find
Mhm.
beautiful, and I do find myself drawn to certain imagery, and I'm wondering, how does that play a role in your own writing?
Yeah, these are great questions that I wish I had a succinct answer to. Maybe like in the poem that I open with, just like this yet, the like comma yet, and the poem ends with the swallows in the mold yet, right? Like this kind of like I grew up evangelical Christian. I think I was really drawn towards the more, let's say, like Orthodox or Catholic elements within that from a pretty early age. I loved all the bells and smells, which was not what I grew up in.
Hmm.
I think I grew up in a sort of very spiritual but not religious sort of Christianity. And so to me, I was drawn towards, yeah, what you're describing as religious. There's a kind of like aspiration that's really beautiful to me, where like if one starts to read these as prescriptive, maybe it's like the rules again, right? If you start to read them as rules, a lot of violence can enter, right? Like a
Hmm.
lot of
Yeah.
demand and so on. But like if you start to think of it as a space for permission to reach beyond your own grasp, then it can become really beautiful and useful. It becomes like a gesture of hope despite rather than like a punitive space. So like I'm
Hmm.
thinking that's kind of like the yet, right? It's like the turn towards just the comma yet. In that poem, I was hoping like that was sort of the whole idea that I entered that poem with. I wanted this just kind of like this, yet this, yet this, yet this, yet this, then some sort of this, yet, like,
Yeah.
and that was it. Just this sort of like musical idea.
Yeah.
Um, and so somehow it led to the form it did. But it's kind of like that, this, yet, it's like it gives you this, or I think can strive towards an orientation that it faces you that is impossible or feels impossible or seems impossible. And yet you have to remind yourself daily and through some sort of ritualized or prescribed orientation that the yet is still possible, whether that's, meditative, contemplative, looking to some sort of return or coming community or what have you. Like there's some sort of orientation to something outside. And like that, if one thinks of it not as if you're not doing it, you're going to hell or something, like some terrifying orientation like this,
Hmm.
if it's not fear based and if it's based around, yeah, the fire, and that's sort of the tongue of fire, right? Which is like I'm thinking of Pentecost in the sort of Christian tradition there, where these tongues of fire descend above the heads of the apostles. That was sort of that gesture that I was hoping
Yeah.
for, like this sense of like it is here and now if one orients oneself to it.
Hmm.
And yeah, rather than confines oneself, to a set of rules.
Yeah. I will say it also, for whatever reason, evoked an image of essentially, like a phoenix rising from the ashes. There's something transcendent in these small moments and stuff. And I know that may be a bit of an associative leap with that particular line, but there is also a very transcendent quality to a lot of the work that you did in field, in that you obviously you're wrestling with a lot of loss. There's lamentation, but it's
Mhm.
also, there's so much room for divinity, for love, for all of these other things, in spite of, suffering terrible losses, and
Mhm.
finding reinvention, finding rebirth, and these wonderful qualities. And I think that's one of the great things about, one of the many great things about that book, is the fact that you show these these wonderful reinventions with language. And so it goes to show that there are so many more layers that can be ascribed to a variety of experiences, and that through it all, that you have very distinctive loss, but you also have very, loss as a universal concept, and almost like I don't want to say a place of worship, although I'm sure there are people out there who worship loss, but there's also a worship of the gathering and stuff, that sense of the communal, and that's very present for me when I read Field, and also Year and Other Poems, especially given like kind of in and around the time period, when you had constructed a lot of these. Could you read the second sonnet from issue 1?
Absolutely. This is a sonnet. Like dead leaves, like wrappers on the surface of a pond, beside a yard of run-of-the-mill fennel weed. By the pile of bricks, we spoke of scars in the back of your car, writing an excuse some days to fail to speak to you, the saddened powers, etc. I, a song and dance man, alone at the mountain's foot, alone at the feet of clay. Life anteriorizes the living, like my insides are outsides, and my outsides, outsides too. My name was not the form, not even the look. Beside you in a queue, like a book, where such namelessnesses meet. Outside the Bank of America, I wept.
God, it's beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
I was wondering, how does your role as an educator and as a teacher in general, how does that influence or contribute to your work? And how do you feel, I guess, by that token, how do your students play a role in your work, and how do they perhaps contribute to your writing?
These are good questions. Let's see. I think teaching has changed me as a person, which has in turn changed my writing, more so than maybe teaching, I don't know, like that say teaching gives me access to other kinds of writing or engagements that it wouldn't have either, otherwise. And so then I learn things from this. I feel like it's more just like the posture of teaching has taught me a lot. I think it just has me talk more than I think I've ever talked in my life. So like that's part of it, is like I was very distrustful of talk in a sort of like casual talk way, in a way that I like it a lot more now. I feel like small talk was really, really terrifying to me, and now I kind of get it, that it's like just kind of like play, it's like not
Mm-hmm.
the high stakes that it felt like it was to me otherwise. And I feel like I learned that kind of from teaching and from students. There's a way in which, like, I think I had something of an ego about what writing meant to me, and then expecting it to mean that to other people. And teaching, you have to like totally, it's your job to let go of that, like it's not for you to decide. And so you have to have this kind of, I mean, I don't know if I have to, but to me, it feels you have to have like a openness to the many different kinds of poetries that exist, but also the many different kinds of orientations to a given type of poetry might exist,
Mm-hmm.
which hasn't changed maybe the orientation I have, but it has me be more cognizant maybe of the orientation I have and put it in context a little more. But also just, I don't know, maybe a little bit of grace and play with it. Like I think what got me into poems initially was play.
Mm-hmm.
And then somewhere along the way, it became very serious business in my mind. So students, it's like brings back that sense of play a bit. I think quite literally ways that they've taught me though is like I was teaching at UC Riverside for a year this last year, and in the poems I'm working on now, a student brought in a generative writing exercise, and I did it, and it produced a poem that I liked that's going in my manuscript, and I'm gonna thank them, and in the thanks and everything, like it's like quite literally at times, yeah,
Yeah,
created the context for work. So it definitely impacts this way.
that's awesome. It's interesting you brought up the discomfort with small talk. I've noted that for myself, I've had to work on that quite a bit. And in my experience, like at one point in my life, I mean, I was very reliant on drugs and alcohol to be able to, like,
Yeah.
make social situations much more comfortable. And now, almost 20 years sober and stuff, looking back on it, seems like a very foreign experience to me, even though I know for myself I have a lot of anxiety still in and
Mhm.
around social situations, part of which I think I do a fairly decent job of masking it in order to
Mhm.
be able to feel more at ease, and especially when I'm speaking to people who are strangers. It could still be challenging, but it's definitely, I think it's more rewarding now because at least in these instances I'm more coherent. So
Yeah, yeah. That resonates with me too. And I'm less mad. I
yeah,
feel like
yes.
I was like
Absolutely.
on the sad to mad scale
Yes.
of drunk. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'm glad not to.
Where can people find you online? And is there anything that you wanted to promote and just kind of highlight as we wrap things up?
Let's see. They can find me online. I like to not be online, but I understand the use. Yeah, I'm on Instagram. I think it's just Jos Charles, might be Jos D Charles. I mostly go on there for the targeted advertisements. Uh, so like I'm not really super active. It's just like all books and lingerie. A book that I blurbed recently that is out is Jasmine Gibson's A Beauty Has Come. And I really like this book quite a bit, and I would recommend people check it out. It's from Nightboat Books or through Nightboat Books. They're really, really gorgeous and really capacious in a way that resonates to me. I just think it's a really gorgeous work that's worth checking out.
Awesome. Well, Joss, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really wonderful conversation. And I'm looking forward, as always, to reading more of your work and being able to hear you read again. We will certainly be on the lookout for readings of yours coming up. And
Mhm.
also, I know that you do workshops occasionally, so I highly suggest our listeners and readers keep an eye out for workshops that you're doing because I believe they would probably be quite wonderful.
Thank you. That is a thing I could have promoted. I forgot. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Adam.
Alex Braslavsky, welcome to the Broken Lens podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Adam.
I'd like to have you start by reading Oliphant from issue 4.
Absolutely. Oliphant. And it's cruel that they plop down a mere kiddie pool for you in that menagerie, your eyes eddied like lozenges. Even at such quiver tendering, they laugh so. Such underbelly weighs down my lashes. Now you drop your head weight to please gravity. They say you never forget, blinking, pensive, but imagine your slinky heart isn't in chains after all. Our mouths are full of dust. I chew you a short straw and you nibble my shoelace. Dragonflies scat over thick water. With your agape arm, you swing history, give sugary yops to the nascent horizon, wink luxuriously as if to say, très chouette. We don't need this zoo sign to tell us about our species. Your tongue is teasing. Your ears are exhaling. I don't want to sit on your weary back. I'm just trying to grow these ears. But if you please, never let me down. Never let my body down.
When reading your poems, I find myself drawn to your use of pastiche and these like wonderful electric juxtapositions that you create. So, for example, like I'm thinking about the line, give sugary yops to the nascent horizon. There's this incredible vibrancy that unfolds in the images. And I can hear in your work something that is Whitmanian, surreal, and is feel as though I'm caught up in the musicality of the lines. I'm also thinking of the line "Your eyes eddied like lozenges," and it evokes images for me that I feel like I would come across in a Magritte painting. When thinking about your writing, do you find yourself navigating to surrealism? And how do you feel techniques like pastiche or perhaps non sequiturs strengthen like the musicality in your lines?
Thanks for noting those elements in my work. I've definitely had a lot of people discuss the purpose of the non sequitur in my work with me. And it's been a challenge to sort of develop that technique with a plume and make it have purpose in my work rather than just letting it be sort of a willy-nilly decision for the sake of being anti-linear or, just having fun, I guess, on the page rather than it actually being attributed with a kind of a seriousness that I am going for. So it is kind of a balancing act, I guess, of humor. And I want to write narrative in a way that doesn't follow classic senses of how time passes. So that's part of what I go for. So part of plunging into an image like the lozenges is that that feels true to how eyes behave and moving between different parts of the body of this sort of ancient elephantine creature, is what feels true to observation, rather than seeing the whole. And so I think you can feel the eye flitting between different parts of the physiology there. And I feel like that's how time is processed. That time is this huge organism, and we're looking at different parts of its body at different points, and past, present, and future spliced together like that. So that's kind of what I'm trying to achieve. I think it's taken a long time to figure out ways in which to achieve that more effectively.
Mm-hmm. When I think about my own writing, I use a lot of pastiche, and for me, there's a lot of weird, disjointed juxtaposition, and it's intentional, partly because that's how my brain operates, and that like I'm, firing off different things at multiple times, and I think in a very non-linear way, and I'm very disjointed as a person, and so the way that that unfolds is that it's not moving in a straight line. And I did have a conversation with another poet, poet Heller Levinson, where we talked about the fact that there's, time being nonlinear, but moving in like a circle and everything. And so being able to evoke that on the page. And I think that, to your point, that a lot of your lines really do that very effectively. And it's interesting because I can see now that you had mentioned kind of like taking a different approach to narrative in this way. I like the idea of turning narrative on its head and kind of like putting it in a different frame when you're reading it. So I appreciate that and stuff, because I'm not one that personally, like, I don't find myself drawn to narrative poetry as often, but I like how you're still telling a story, but there's so many other like elements being woven in there, and there's almost a Pynchonian quality to it and stuff. Like I think of Pynchon's novel V, and the way that narrative unfolds in a way that is very nonlinear until it all comes together at a point. So I appreciate that. I feel like there is also environmentalism present in your work, and I wouldn't characterize your writing as necessarily falling under the umbrella of eco-poetics, but there is a clear line that's like drawn to the natural world. And I think of the elephant, or the elephant tusk, I should say, like in Oliphant, presence of plastic in your piece, Beach Travesty, the evaporation of permafrost, juxtaposed with a, personal relationship and that evaporation. And I was wondering how environmentalism infuses your work, and do you find yourself consciously including it in your poetry, or is it something that just kind of finds its way into it by virtue of your subconscious or just kind of environmental stimuli?
The environment definitely takes on a kind of it is like creatures, animals are very much overtaking my poetry at all points, but I think I also am very invested in the force of things, kind of inanimate objects. So trash. I write about trash as well.
Mhm.
Future trash. So kind of a sense of impending concern for the environment. But I would say that things dissipating, permafrost, these are things that I sort of write about with a sense of foreboding, but also humor, I guess,
Mhm.
because I do believe that nature will overtake all of our whims and wiles. So I guess observing nature without pitying her is really important to
Mhm.
me in my work. And also, even though trash is disgusting, there's sort of a rehabilitation of trash as well that I'm concerned with. I write, about dogs, about horses, grew up with, parents who loved animals more
Mhm.
than people. So I think that that just sort of naturally happens. At the moment, I'm reading The Over Story by Richard Powers, and it's this
Mhm.
really fabulous recapitulation of history, but also a narrative told from the voice of trees. And I think
Mhm.
that that just sort of feels like a very natural inclination to
Mhm.
non not really anthropocentric concerns. It's very rare that I'll write about love, and if I do, it's a sort of degradation that feels almost like a reverse evolution. There's something very close to nature there. But yeah,
Yeah.
but I still have a fascination for made objects, things made by humans, you know, ceramics, again, trash. I'm still interested in things that are left behind. So the artificial still matters.
Hmm. Absolutely. It's interesting that you bring that up because my brother, who's a playwright and a director, had written a play many years ago about the gyre in the Pacific Ocean, and he had imagined it as turning into these almost small islands, continents and stuff of trash that were just floating out in the Pacific Ocean, and he had set an entire play like in this environment and the omnipresence of things. I mean, I think of the apartment that I'm sitting in right now, and I have amassed a lot of crap, and and certainly that plays a role, but it's also interesting the idea of like how dependent we've become upon it, and how do we break that dependency, and then putting that into the context of like personal relationships and codependency and all these ideas. And I think that's what's so wonderful about your writing is that it brings up all of these connections, and there's a lot of intertextuality that's happening and stuff in terms of you, I think, talking to other writers. So I could see you in conversation with Powers. There's something that's there, and also just the exchange of ideas. It's quite wonderful. I was wondering if I could have you read Beach Travesty.
Beach travesty. Myocmia. The corner of my eye has begun twitching. Then I heard this. I swallowed a pit. The groats of the snow turned over my face, shuffled themselves in their ordinances into the joints of paper birches. Then heard. Feel slimy before we shimmy in coconut oil before bed. So odd, they all fall asleep like that while the fly dips its hands and dips its back into my tea. Now it's swimming away from the fat of the eye, expecting them to give more than they do end up giving. As if in the operating room there was not a speck of dust in Franz's calculated apartment. I feel entitled to what I've cleaned. I thought it was interesting your stretching out face video in the cup of your palm. Your belief in food freedom. Is it plastic free? I tried joint searches. One lake, frosted, bicycles, and yellowish slush, furious and muddy. She was bending. She was a tugboat ganglion. As far as I'm concerned, what Father's Day was this?
Beautiful. Shifting gears, in addition to being a poet, you're also a translator. I gather you are a phenomenal polyglot because you speak multiple languages, and I feel like I can barely speak English some days. I find myself, when I think about work in translation, like I find myself drawn to Japanese, Scandinavian, and French writers, typically because of their economy of language. And I was wondering, how does your work in translation strengthen your writing? And is there a particular language that you find yourself particularly drawn to as a result of your scholarship or just kind of in general?
I started to work in translation when I was in my master's and I was studying Polish for the first time. And interestingly enough, I thought that working in Russian was a lot harder, and I still think that way, even though it's my heritage language. There was a lot more pressure to translate from your heritage language. I just felt so much more inadequate. And I also started to notice that there were just ways in which my field was not adequately addressing other Slavic traditions. So, I was reading Szymborska when I first embarked on learning how to write poetry, and that was what really got me interested in Polish. And I mean, Szymborska is not eco-poetic outright, but she's definitely, writing about fractured roses or about dogs, things of that nature, in a way that has a twinge of humor and is sort of really appealed to me. So I think I ended up becoming a translator of Polish poetry, first off. But now I'm working on a project translating a Czech poet named Bohumila Gregorova, who wrote a collection about the process of going blind in her 80s.
Oh, wow.
And she's a concrete poet earlier in her career, and she is very invested in the appearance of the words on the page and their arrangement on the page. But later on, she can't see her own words anymore. So she ends up investing the words themselves with a lot more imagistic power. And you can kind of see how she moves from being visual to visionary and sort of kind of an internal vision that inner vision that she develops. And I think that it's really interesting also going into Czech, the surrealist tradition of Czech, but also she's reformulating what it means to have vision. And part of that, how she does that, is she documents the warping colors in her sight, the blotches, the things that she's frustrated, or the blurs, what she sees in them. And so it is kind of a surrealist treatment, but it's also very real, It's actually what she's seeing as she loses her sight. So those things matter to me, and they impact when I translate people like her. That impacts my eye. That impacts how I'm seeing what I'm writing about. So that's what I would say in response to the question about translation. Zuzana Ginczanka, the Polish Jewish poet I translated for the book project that came out this year called On Centaurs, was she was surreal in many senses, but not of the surrealist tradition, and she was definitely avant-garde. And one of the things she did was create a lot of neologisms, which is something that I do in the Oliphant poem. Hers are a lot more complex than mine, I think, but I've always been invested in that. So I think that I had an affinity for her work, and she taught me how to build better word sentence, build better neologisms. So I'm constantly training under these predecessors, and translation for me feels like it's both reading and writing at the same time, but also it's training. It's also paying homage. It's a lot of different things for me.
I'm assuming that there's opportunities for collaboration when doing translations. I can imagine that even if the author that you're working on has like long since passed, there's still opportunities to work with other scholars and writers. Do you feel like those opportunities for collaboration also strengthen your work? Are they also something that you can like take things away from and then apply to your own writing?
Collaborative translation is a really big topic in the translation world right now, alongside self-translation.
Mm-hmm.
They're very big areas of study right now, and I would say that I'm very interested in not only collaborating more as a translator, but also acknowledging how much collaboration goes into translation work much more transparently. Something I've been reflecting on a lot, in part because I don't think any translation is without it just can't be the whole thing can't be extricated from collaboration because you are translating someone else's work. So your kind of writerly sensibilities are intertwining with theirs. You're creating this sort of double-headed hydra. You're creating a mythological, you're fusing bodies. It's like a very strange, very intimate experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think besides that, you're hopefully, if you're doing due diligence as a translator, you're also consulting people who are native speakers, people who aren't native speakers, people who, somebody, who likes the specific subject knows, I had to email a biologist about describing a particular part of a plant when I was doing my last translation project because my poet was very interested in biology and cosmology and different ologies. So, I mean, that's the fun part is really figuring out the terminology for these obsessions,
Mm-hmm.
and diving in. But there have been many poets in the past, such as Joseph Brodsky, who, really behind the scenes kind of collaborated quite substantially, but would do so in a way that I feel is I'm really grateful for some of the recent work that's been done on Brodsky to kind of acknowledge how he collaboratively self-translated. So that's a combination of the two phenomena that we're really interested in the translation. Yeah. He would ask people to translate his work, like a group of different translators, and then he would choose his favorites or choose between parts of various translations, and then he would cut and combine, and then actually this whole process of collaborative translation, self-translation, excuse
Mm-hmm.
me, is how he ended up becoming a bilingual poet. So
Mm-hmm.
how he sort of transformed himself into a full-fledged American poet. But it was on the backs of the labor of a lot of different translators. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
really grateful for Natasha Ruliova's work, which kind of opens up that process for everyone and just shows, what translation really looks like. At the end of the day, those were his translations of his own work, but
Mm-hmm.
a lot of other people participated in the process. I think I want to avoid that at all costs, not saying that I would ever venture to translate my own work, but I do want to avoid being presumptuous or entitled about I did collaborate with a lot of people for this last project, and I want to be open about that,
Mm-hmm.
about all of those things. And I think one person who does a very good job of that, or who has, is Tracy K. Smith. She did a really great translation, collaborative translation with Yao Yilei. She did a collaborative translation with Chong Tai Bi. So Chong Tai Bi translated everything kind of more literally into English, and Tracy K. Smith and poeticized everything, but she
Mm-hmm.
never just put her name along. Like, I think that she was very transparent about the whole process, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's a really good way forward
Mm-hmm.
for the translation world to sort of be very frank about, how many that these things happen in teams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You brought up neologisms, and I also think of like just idioms in local languages and how I would think with like idiomatic language with slang and stuff. I mean, if you start infusing that into the work, you need native speakers to work with to be able to kind of properly capture those nuances. And I can definitely see where having collaboration is essential to ensuring that the richness of the language and trying to honor the intentions of the author. And I have seen that debate play out where there's been a lot of authors who've, I think, have been criticized for, either appropriating the work of the original author and then trying to kind of turn it into their own work. There's a lot of back and forth on it. Clearly, it's above my pay grade, but I think it's still an interesting debate about the fidelity to the original language, and then being able to ensure that you're honoring the intentions of the author and making sure that whatever you're doing is conceptually sound while still ensuring that the musicality and the words is still very present in the work that's being shared. We were talking before we started recording about the fact you're in your fourth year of your PhD program.
Yeah.
I was wondering, how does your role as an educator influence your work?
Oh, that's a lovely question. At the moment, I have only taught 2 courses, three, two of them language courses. So a lot of what ends up happening is seeing students go their first year language courses for Russian and Czech. So see students drop down to this level of being able to only speak as an infant would, and seeing their language be born again from that point.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always a really magical experience. And there's a really big, fierce sort of energy that arises in the body, I think, in a student who really cares to learn. There's a desire to be able to speak, and there's a desire to be able to write. And it's really exciting to learn your first words at any point in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Language learning will always have a really important place in my heart, and being able to share the love of languages with others that I have in my just technical know-how with Slavic grammatical structures is it's really fun, because it's quite magical to think about the fact that, for example, in Russian, to explain to a student, "Мне холодно" is how you say it's cold, but you're basically saying almost fatalistically, it is cold to me, not I am cold.
Okay.
You don't own the cold. And that's not really how it works in the Russian psyche. So I think that just having those moments where students really start to reformulate a way of seeing the world while in the language is really, that's what's most cool. And I think you mentioned translation earlier. Learning languages and sharing that love of learning languages with others really sparks kind of a love for putting things in very odd ways in my poetry, in ways that feel translated, in ways that feel like there is a different cultural viewpoint at the pith of what the phrasing is. So I guess that's my answer to your question.
I've spoken to other educators who teach at various levels, and it is always refreshing to hear about how working with students opens them up to new questions about their own work, about perception, about how they engage, and how that ends up playing a role in feeding how they write and how they relate to language and or to art or to photography. And I really appreciate that. I was wondering if I could have you read Permafrost Drive-Through.
Permafrost Drive-Through. I met him because he was staring at tennis balls. Too sick to meet on a Friday afternoon. He's 22 and day drinks. Where does darkness leave off and light begin? It's not a poem. It's a shark in formaldehyde. And you will therefore realize the possibilities of accomplishing the same thing by means of the principle of polarity. When it comes to beautiful, useless men. If I don't hear from them, I will email them that there should be an ocean, but there isn't, just as there isn't a name for this planet. We don't have a panel about permafrost, but the director of graduate studies seems to think so with beveled eyes. Not to worry. A disco is starting by the milk station. Its 100-candle, stochastic halo slice. I've never driven over a cloud before.
That's beautiful. You're talking about something that's so common in terms of meeting up with somebody, and like even as the reader, like I can imagine it being almost like a first date situation or something. There's a sense of disappointment, but then there's also this incredible, I don't know, like just drawing in all these other disparate elements and stuff and fusing them in such a way that you're world building. And I appreciate these discordant images and bringing them all together in a way that like you're formulating something very surreal, and still it's surreal, but then also, you know, very grounded in our world and our experience. My last question is, you selected Grow by Sigrid for our playlist, and I wanted to know, what is it about the song or the artist that you're drawn to, and does her music have influence over your writing?
Yes, Sigrid has a very special place in my heart, partially because she wears white t-shirts and jeans for like the majority of her, she's just she's an interesting pop star. She's also very interested in nature. She loves cats. So I find her to be just a lovely, lovely person to have out there singing.
Yeah.
She wanted to be a lawyer originally, was studying the law in Norway, and then decided to sing. And she has a grit, kind of a growl in her voice that I really appreciate a lot. Yeah, she reminds me a lot of people like, Joan Baez, Joni Mitchell. Like, I think she knows where she is in terms of lineage too, which is comforting. I think this song has a simplicity to it that's very lovely. I love this particular album. I don't know what to say about the song other than the fact that it is about growing, and I think that in terms of my own art, I'm not really trying to impress anyone. I didn't start publishing poems until 10 years after I started writing them. Part of it was just I want to get better. And I like songs about growing, about not taking things for granted, and not feeling as though other people are to blame in any way necessarily. I think that's why I like the ethos of that particular song. I guess I don't expect to be where I want to be poetically overnight.
That's very reasonable and measured, I guess, perspective to take on writing, because I find myself sometimes I'm very much the opposite. I'm very impatient, and so I want to be able to get whatever is going through my head and in the process of drafting work, out onto the paper as I imagine it. And the writing process doesn't work like that. And I think as I've gotten older and gone through the ringer on rejection, and still feeling stung some days, but like it gets a little bit better when you start to realize that it's not a blanket condemnation of your capabilities as a writer. Sometimes you just don't fit into certain spaces. And I know that in my experience that I'm finding more comfort in being a square peg in a round hole. And I think that's something that is important, and that is part of a growth process as a writer. I can definitely appreciate that sentiment. Lastly, can you tell us, where people can find you online and your publications and such?
I don't have any social media. I'm kind of very aesthetic. So I only have a website, and the website is alexbraslavsky.com. And on the website, on my contact page is my email address. So I do email very promptly and get back to people. So if anyone wants to talk poetry, I welcome an email. I'm starting to publish some nonfiction, so that will start appearing on my website soon. And I have tabs with translation, poetry, scholarship, etc. for people who are interested.
Wonderful. Well, I definitely recommend to our listeners to seek out Alex's work, and please check out all of her poems in issue 4. Alex, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your work and talk poetry with me.
Thank you, Adam, for all of your wonderful questions and formulations. And everyone should go check out Broken Lens. They're an awesome journal. Lots of great poems, lots of great stuff being published with them.
Thank you. We appreciate it. All right. We will talk soon.
Yes. Take care.
Bye. Thank you to Jos Charles and Alex Braslavsky for joining on this episode. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're enjoying the podcast, leave us a review.
And as a reminder, we accept submissions year-round at brokenlensjournal.com.
Thanks as always to our producer, Destiny. Our theme music was composed and recorded by Art Santora. I'm Adam.
And I'm Heather.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.